In the fall of 1974, wedged into a corner of a strip mall on Gulf Road in Schaumburg, Illinois, sandwiched between a Jewel Foods, a turnstile, and a House of Brides, one of the most interesting rock clubs in Chicago history, quietly opened its doors. Today we're discussing beginnings where Schaumburg rocked Chicago's suburbs. I'm Tommy Henry, and this is the Chicago History Podcast. When the drummer from one of the world's biggest bands of the 1970s decided he wanted to build a new music venue, he chose to do so in the sprawl northwest of Chicago, at a place called the Woodfield Commons Shopping Center. It just screams rock and roll, right? The man behind this effort was Danny Seraphine, the founding drummer of the rock band Chicago. Born Daniel Peter Seraphine on August 28, 1948, he grew up in Dunning, which at the time was a tough Italian neighborhood on Chicago's northwest side. Seraphine started playing drums at the age of 9 while attending St. Priscilla Catholic grade school. When he was 15 years old, Seraphine dropped out of Steinmetz High School. He was running with a violent street gang called the Junior Palace before music pulled him off a very different trajectory. In a later interview, Seraphine was blunt about what might have happened without music. Quote, "No one knows, but it wouldn't have been pretty. I quit school, I was confused, and I was with a violent crowd. I wasn't headed in a very good direction." Among the people Seraphine knew from the old neighborhood was Tony the Ant Spilatro, the notorious Chicago outfit enforcer later immortalized by Joe Pesci in the 1995 Martin Scorsese film Casino. Quote, "He was always really nice to me and cordial," Seraphine recalled. "He was even proud of me, after Chicago's success, that I came from the neighborhood, but you knew you were around dangerous people." By the time he and his bandmates, including guitarist Terry Kath and woodwind player Walt Parazater, had transformed the Chicago Transit Authority, later shortened to simply Chicago because of threatened legal action by the actual Chicago Transit Authority, into one of the best-selling rock acts of the 1970s, Seraphine had seen nearly every dive bar, roadhouse, and cramped backstage in America, and he hated most of them. "I was dead set on opening a musical showcase where bands would be excited to play," Seraphine wrote in his 2011 memoir, Street Player, My Chicago Story. "It was important to separate beginnings from dive bars and dead-end clubs. I wanted it to be seen as the gold standard of rock clubs in the area." The name came from one of Chicago's most beloved songs, Beginnings, written by keyboardist Robert Lamb, a lush, horn-driven ballad from the band's 1969 debut album. While the song Beginnings had the proper spelling, the venue Beginnings was spelled with a B apostrophe, Ginnings. Seraphine opened the club in September 1974, just 3 years after Woodfield Mall had transformed Schaumburg from a sleepy farming community into the retail epicenter of the northwest suburbs. A little more on Schaumburg. When it was incorporated in 1956, the village of Schaumburg, which straddles Cook and DuPage counties, had only 130 people. 4 years later, in 1960, the population of the village had grown to nearly 1,000 people. Within a few years, the Northwest Highway, later renamed the Kennedy Expressway, would open, and white flight, the desire for suburban living, would cause the number of residents to swell. By 1970, the village's population was almost 19,000 and would reach more than 50,000 by the decade's end. The area around Woodfield was thick with new restaurants, hotels, and commercial strips trying to serve this freshly minted suburbia. Beginnings was Seraphine's bet that the same young professionals pouring into the subdivisions off Roselle Road and Meacham Road wanted something more than dinner at a chain restaurant on a Friday night. He was right, at least for a while. According to Lynn Van Matra, the Chicago Tribune rock critic back in the day, although Danny Seraphine was the face of the venue, he was one of 3 owners. The other two were Larry Balsamo, who owned the Rush West Inn on Roosevelt Road in suburban Glen Ellen. In interviews, Balsamo described himself as the bar brains of the new operation. The third was John Bracamontes, a local booking agent. Seraphine, who was living in Encino, California at the time, claimed he got involved, quote, because I need different things to occupy my time. Chicago's not touring as much these days. We're spending more of our time in the studio than on the road, and I've got months sometimes with nothing to do. Besides, I've always loved the city, except for the weather. Danny Seraphine and John Bracamontes had known each other for years before going into business together. Quote, John's brother and I were best friends growing up on the Northwest Side, according to Seraphine. In fact, he coached my football team when I was a kid. When asked why Schaumburg, Larry Balsamo responded, because there are a lot of people out here who like music but have to go to the city now to hear it. This way there's something for them out here, but it's not too far for people from the city to drive to shows. And there's plenty of parking. The owners plan to present 50 concerts a year featuring bands on their way up, and on nights when larger concerts weren't planned, local bands would get their shot. One of the first was Pez Band, a power pop band formed in 1971 in Oak Park, Illinois. Pez Band would later tour the world, opening for Fleetwood Mac and Supertramp, and release a few albums. One of their releases was a live EP called 30 Seconds Over Schaumburg, recorded in 1979 at Beginnings. Walking into Beginnings was said to be nothing like entering any other suburban nightclub of the era. Instead of interior decorators, Seraphine and his partners hired set designers to create the club's atmosphere, and what they built was essentially a love letter to the streets of Chicago. The interior was decorated to resemble an urban streetscape, complete with building facades, working stoplights, elevated train tracks overhead, and real Chicago street signs bolted to the walls. A full-scale replica of the Chicago Theater marquee was backlit and mounted on the ceiling above the main bar. Another bar was constructed to look like an old-fashioned newsstand. One wall featured a painted panorama of the Chicago skyline. Another rock historian remembered Beginnings as, quote, the classiest of the suburban rock venues, featuring eye candy hostesses combined with ear-piercing Marshall stacks. The stage was enormous for a nightclub, 16 feet deep and 32 feet wide, equipped with $50,000 worth of professional sound and lighting equipment, a staggering investment in the mid-1970s equal to $330,000 today. Black velvet curtains framed the performance area, and a hand-painted wooden sign reading Beginnings hung center stage above the rear wall. Upstairs, accessible by ladder near the entrance, a sound and lighting booth gave the engineers a bird's-eye view of the room. The Chicago Punk Database later described the club as, quote, a little smaller than Park West, the famed 700-capacity Northside venue, but that probably understated matters on a packed Saturday night. The dressing room was the stuff of legend. Reportedly costing $20,000 to build out, it featured soundproofing, showers, lighted vanity mirrors, a telephone, and, in a touch that must have endeared Beginnings to every working band that passed through, a beer tap built right into the wall. Gold records from Chicago and other acts lined the walls. For musicians accustomed to changing in broom closets and bathrooms at most road gigs, the Beginnings dressing room must have felt like the big time. Out front, the club featured 3 bars, a full restaurant, and a sunken dance floor made of polished stainless steel that the staff kept gleaming with polish. According to the Chicago Tribune, all seating was off the ground, bar stools surround high tables and bars. When I hear people talk about long-gone music venues in Chicago that I'd never got to go to, like Biddy Mulligan's or Thirsty Whale, one of the first questions that comes to my mind is, how many people could this place hold? The precise capacity of Beginnings was, depending on the source, either a matter of public record or a running joke. The Schaumburg Fire Marshal had posted a maximum capacity sign near the dance floor that read 936, but it seems few people treated that number as anything more than a suggestion. The Daily Herald, the dominant suburban newspaper, listed the club's concert capacity at 1,800, nearly double the fire marshal's limit. Danny Seraphine himself recalled about 1,200 as a more typical packed house number. What is certain is that on major concert nights, Beginnings regularly crammed in far more bodies than any fire code would allow. For the opening of Beginnings, Danny Seraphine did what any drummer in one of the world's biggest rock bands at the time would do. He asked his band to play the first two nights as a favor. The story of how that favor was compensated became one of the club's founding legends. According to keyboardist Robert Lamb, a founding member of Chicago and the writer of many of their early hits, Seraphine initially promised the band a couple of grand for the performance. After the rest of the group agreed, Seraphine broke the news. "I'm having trouble getting my bread together, and I can't pay you." He's like a typical club owner, Lamb joked. Seraphine remembers it differently, claiming the band agreed in advance to play the back-to-back shows for the princely fee of $1, the band's lowest-paying gig ever. Whatever the price tag, the result was pandemonium. Tickets were $9, nearly $60 today, and sold out within 24 hours. The club was packed far beyond its legal limit, with fans lined up for hours. Oh, I should mention the drinking age at the time. After the repeal of Prohibition on December 5, 1933, with the ratification of the 21st Amendment, Illinois set the drinking age at 21 for all alcohol, consistent with nearly every other state. After the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18 in 1971, many states, including Illinois, reconsidered their drinking ages. In 1973, Illinois lowered the drinking age to 19 for beer and wine, while keeping 21 for hard liquor. Some Illinois communities with home rule powers set their own local age as low as 18, creating what I assumed to be was a confusing patchwork. For instance, downstate Urbana allowed 18-year-olds to drink, while neighboring Champaign required drinkers to be 19. Back to opening night. Not everyone was charmed by the Suburbs' new rock venue. The Chicago Tribune's Clarence Page, who covered the opening, criticized the bouncers as, quote, arm-grabbing goons disguised as ushers, and dismissed the venue as nothing new in comparison to thousands of other roadside discotheques that dot the suburbs. All it needs is nude go-go dancers to complete its image. The bouncer problem and the broader controversy surrounding the club's relationship with local authorities would dog Beginnings throughout its existence. Life at Beginnings followed a nightly ritual. Doors open at 8 p.m. and shows typically started an hour later. Each evening, the club stage manager and DJ would take the microphone at 9 p.m. and deliver the Beginnings greeting over the horn instrumental from Chicago's Introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Beginnings, the concert club of the Midwest, featuring the best in live entertainment 7 nights a week. The announcer would rattle through the weekly schedule. Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday were 25-cent beer and wine nights. Monday was Battle of the Bands. Wednesday was concert night, the marquee event presented by Jam Productions and a radio station partner. Friday and Saturday featured an early bird special with no cover for women before 9 p.m. When the club first opened, it catered to what the Chicago Tribune described as a chic, moneyed suburban crowd over 21. By the time major touring acts were headlining, concert tickets ran about $4 to $5, still an almost absurdly low price for what people were seeing, even if the venue was a bit of a drive from Chicago. From the very start, Beginnings had a rough edge that coexisted uneasily with the lighted vanity mirrors in the dressing room. The arm-grabbing goons that the Tribune complained about on opening night were not an aberration, they were a feature. The club's security staff had a reputation for heavy-handedness that went well beyond the typical suburban bouncer's enthusiasm. In 1976, the Schaumburg Liquor Commission shut Beginnings down temporarily following a series of incidents involving its security personnel. In November of 1975, Gary Miller, a Monmouth, Illinois teacher, was ousted from the bar along with an off-duty Schaumburg detective. Quote, "They," meaning the doorman, "roughed me up and kicked me. They had me in a headlock," Miller said. When police arrived, they found Miller in a semi-dazed condition and the off-duty detective with a bleeding face and in a verbal altercation with a doorman. Miller later filed assault and battery charges against the employees. 4 other area residents reported similar incidents. The shutdown was significant enough to threaten the club's operation. For a venue that depended on nightly revenue from 3 bars, a restaurant, and concert admissions, even a brief closure was financially devastating. The club eventually reopened, but the tension between Beginnings and the village of Schaumburg's regulatory apparatus remained ongoing. Beyond the bouncer problems, there were darker rumors. Persistent allegations of organized crime involvement swirled around the club throughout its existence. Seraphine's own background, growing up in the neighborhood thick with Chicago outfit figures, personally knowing Tony the Ant Spilatro, gave the rumors a veneer of plausibility that was hard to shake. Even the Wall Street Journal ran a piece examining possible mob ties to Beginnings and to the band Chicago itself. Seraphine dismissed the mob allegations as overblown, and no criminal charges related to organized crime were ever brought against the club or its owners, but the rumors contributed to an atmosphere of edginess that was simultaneously part of Beginnings' allure and a source of ongoing friction with local authorities. Early financial mismanagement compounded the problems at Beginnings. Seraphine couldn't understand why the club wasn't making money, despite being packed night after night. When a friend of Seraphine's was brought in to assess operations at Beginnings, he broke the bad news. Employee theft was rampant. In his book, Seraphine claims he had everyone take a lie detector test. Only 2 employees passed. He fired everyone and brought in a whole new staff. Danny Seraphine eventually bought out his partners and installed new management, which stabilized things, at least temporarily. But the financial picture was never as rosy as the packed houses suggested. There were also inevitable tensions that come with a suburban nightclub drawing enormous crowds of young people fueled by 25-cent beers. In 1975, admission was $2 at the door, beers were 20 cents before 8 p.m., and mixed drinks went for $1.25. Quarter beer nights on Sundays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays kept the place packed on off nights, but also meant the crowd was considerably more intoxicated than at venues with standard drink prices. A huge part of what made Beginnings punch above its weight was its relationship with Jam Productions, the Chicago concert promotion firm founded in 1972 by Jerry Mickelson and Arnie Granite. Jam did the bookings for Beginnings, and their aggressive, taste-making approach to talent buying meant the club consistently landed acts that were on the verge of breaking through nationally. Mickelson and Granite had started their company working as security guards at the Aragon Ballroom before graduating to promoting shows at the Riviera Theater, the Uptown Theater, and other storied Chicago venues. By the mid-1970s, they were the dominant independent concert promoters in the Midwest. Their instinct for spotting talent was practically supernatural. Over the decades, Jam would go on to present the first Chicago area shows by U2 at the Park West in 1981, Prince, who opened for Rick James at the Uptown Theater in 1980, and Nirvana at Metro in 1991. Beginnings was one of the earliest and most important stages in that legacy. Local rock stations were deeply entwined with the club as well. WXRT recorded live unconcerts at Beginnings, and shows were frequently presented in partnership with WJKL The Fox at 94.3 FM, which had shifted to a progressive rock format in 1974 the same year the club opened. Later, WLUP The Loop at 97.9 FM and WMET would also be involved in presenting and broadcasting shows from the venue. The intersection of live music and FM radio gave Beginnings a reach far beyond its suburban strip mall location. What set Beginnings apart from every other suburban nightclub in the 1970s was its uncanny ability, thanks in large part to Jam Productions' booking savvy, to land acts just before they became famous. The club's location of the suburbs meant it was often the first stop for touring bands on their way into or out of the Chicago market, and the professional-grade stage and sound system made it an appealing option for even acts that might have preferred a city venue. Of note, Billy Joel, 1976. Before The Stranger made him a household name in 1977, Billy Joel played Beginnings in April of 1976, not just a one-off show, but a multi-night residency, performing several nights in a row. At the time, Joel was performing behind his album Turnstiles and was still working to build his audience in the Midwest. One fan remembers, "I saw Billy Joel and Michael Martin Murphey at Beginnings, all for a very low cover charge of about $5. Elvis Costello in The Attractions, November 30th, 1977. Elvis Costello's first ever U.S. tour began on November 15th, 1977 at the Old Waldorf in San Francisco, just 2 weeks after Columbia Records released My Aim Is True in America. The skinny Brit with the Buddy Holly glasses, the tight-fitting suit, and the simmering fury was the most talked-about new artist in rock and roll, and Columbia Records had orchestrated a carefully planned national club tour to introduce him to American audiences. On November 30th, 1977, Costello and the Attractions rolled into Beginnings in Schaumburg for what was, by all available evidence, the first ever performance in the Chicago area. The set list that night opened with Welcome to the Working Week, the track that kicks off My Aim Is True, and blazed through songs including The Beat, Lipstick Vogue, The Angels Want to Wear My Red Shoes, and Watching the Detectives. The next night, December 1st, the band played the Electric Ballroom in Milwaukee, and on December 2nd, they hit the Riviera Theater in Chicago proper. But Beginnings had Elvis Costello and the Attractions first. The Police, March 1979. The Police's first appearance in the Chicago area is one of the most frequently cited moments in Beginnings lore, and it came with the kind of underwhelming attendance that makes for a perfect rock and roll origin story. The band, Sting, Andy Summers, and Stuart Copeland, had played their first ever U.S. show at CBGB in New York City on October 20th, 1978, touring behind their yet-to-be-released debut album, Outlandos d'Amour. They traveled from city to city in a cramped Ford Econoline van, carrying their instruments as luggage, playing to tiny crowds for tinier money. By March of 1979, they were back in America for a second run, working their way through the Midwest. According to Setlist FM, the Police played at Headliners in Madison, Wisconsin on March 12, 1979, with Beginnings in Schaumburg as the next stop on their itinerary, placing their first Chicago area appearance on March 13, 1979. Photographer Paul Natkin captured the band on the Beginnings stage in what became some of the club's most iconic images, shared decades later on the Police's official social media. The crowd, by Sting's own recollection, was practically non-existent. At a 2008 reunion concert at the Allstate Arena in Rosemont, Illinois, with thousands of fans screaming for the band that had sold 75 million records worldwide, Sting paused to reflect on where it all started in Chicago. Quote, "What the bleep happened?" he asked the crowd, remembering the band's first appearance at the long-shuttered club Beginnings. His verdict on that frigid night in the Schaumburg suburbs, quote, "It was bleeping cold. 7 people were there. 7 people. At a club with the $50,000 sound system, $20,000 dressing room, and a beer tap in the wall." By May 25, 1979, just 2 months later, the Police had graduated to Park West on Chicago's North Side, playing a full 14-song set to a considerably larger crowd. The trajectory from beginnings to Park West to stadiums happened in barely a year. Talking Heads, October 20th, 1977. More than a month before Elvis Costello arrived, Talking Heads played beginnings on October 20th, 1977. David Byrne, Tina Weymouth, Chris Franz, and Jerry Harrison were touring behind their debut album, Talking Heads 77, which had been released just 3 weeks earlier. They had played at Quiet Night on Belmont in Chicago proper on October 17th and 18th. 2 shows, 9:15 and 11:30. Then the Electric Ballroom in Milwaukee on October 19th before hitting the Schaumburg venue. One fan who attended later recalled seeing them in the lounge at beginnings, suggesting the band may have played the club's smaller side room rather than the main stage, a common practice for newer acts that weren't yet drawing headliner-sized crowds. For my Minnesota listeners of a certain age, Talking Heads next traveled to Minneapolis, where they played 2 nights at Jay's Longhorn Bar on 5th Street. AC/DC, August 1977 and 1978. Australian rockers AC/DC played beginnings twice that I could find, once in August 1977 and again during the Power Age tour in 1978, and both visits became the stuff of legend. The 1978 show in particular has become one of the most vividly recounted evenings in the club's history, thanks to fans who kept their ticket stubs and concert t-shirts for decades. There are also bootleg recordings of those shows. One such fan, William Perry, then a junior at Glenbard East High School, who had just turned 16, recalled the 1978 Powerade show in detail. Tickets were $4. The opening act was the local power pop band Off-Broadway. The Australian headliners were volcanic. Quote, Bon Scott was at the height of his career, and I think Angus Young was only 23 years old. It was the first time I had heard of a wireless guitar, let alone actually seen one. The performance reached its climax when Angus Young, the schoolboy uniformed lead guitarist known for his manic stage antics, climbed on top of Bon Scott's shoulders and was carried out into the crowd. Young then leapt onto a large circular bar in the middle of the club and ran around its entire circumference, shredding his guitar while knocking down glasses and sending beer flying into the air. For a 16-year-old suburban kid, it was reportedly a religious experience. William Perry later declined a $100 offer for his concert t-shirt when his teenage daughter wore it to an AC/DC show at Wrigley Field nearly 4 decades later. The Jam Productions ticket stub for the show, presented with the Fox 94.3 FM, noted that attendees had to be 19 years of age or older, though, as Perry's presence attested, determined teenagers found ways around that requirement. The discrepancy between the posted age policy and the actual age of the crowd was a recurring theme at beginnings, and one more source of tension with local authorities. Van Halen, March 20th, 1978. Van Halen's self-titled debut album was released on February 10th, 1978, and the band launched their first ever world tour on March 3rd at the Aragon Ballroom in Chicago, opening for Journey on Montrose. That first night at the Aragon was reportedly a difficult one. The stage was too small, the band wore absurd 3-inch platform shoes that they could barely walk in, the lighting director's headset malfunctioned, and they left the headlights on in their equipment truck, killing the battery. By March 20th, 1978, the band had worked out some of the kinks, and they made a stop at beginnings. David Lee Roth, Eddie Van Halen, Alex Van Halen, and Michael Anthony were still largely unknown at this point, still months away from the explosive word of mouth that would push their debut album to diamond status. One Beginnings regular recalled a friend winning 2 tickets to see this new band called Van Halen and losing a coin flip for the second ticket, a story that has probably haunted him for nearly 5 decades. Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, August 29th, 1976. Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers played beginnings on that August night, opening for Cheap Trick. This was early enough in Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers' career that the band was still touring behind their self-titled debut. Petty returned to the beginning stage around July 1978, this time as the headliner with Cheap Trick opening, a double bill that in retrospect represents a bonkers amount of talent on a suburban rock venue stage. If any single act defined beginnings, it was Cheap Trick. The Rockford, Illinois band, just 60 minutes northwest of Schaumburg, played the club more times than perhaps any other national act, appearing as early as March 1975 and returning repeatedly through 1977 and beyond. Their gigography documents multiple appearances: February 26th, March 5th, and April 23rd of 1977 alone, plus a show on June 28th, 1977, whose live recording circulates among collectors. For a band still building its audience, In Color wouldn't come out until September 1977, and Live at Budokan was still a year and a half away. Beginnings was a crucial home base. Seraphine himself, who preferred jazz fusion to the power pop of Rick Nielsen and Robin Zander, wasn't always thrilled to have, quote, unknowns like Cheap Trick on his stage. Seraphine thought they should be booking Buddy Rich, but Jam Productions knew what they were doing. The affection between Cheap Trick and Beginnings ran both ways. Years later, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers keyboard player Benmont Tench was riding down Gulf Road after a show at Poplar Creek Music Theater when he asked the driver if he knew where Beginnings used to be. When asked how he could possibly remember playing there, Tench delivered what might be the greatest compliment any rock club has ever received. You don't open for U2 in Dublin, Springsteen in New Jersey, or Cheap Trick in Chicago, and forget where it happened. Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Band, June 23, 1976. Bob Seger's appearance at Beginnings in June of 1976 perfectly captures the club's role as a launching pad. The night before, the Michigan-born Seger had played to a crowd of nearly 80,000 fans at the Pontiac Silverdome outside Detroit. The next evening, he and the Silver Bullet Band performed for a few hundred people at Beginnings, and the show was broadcast live on WXRT. The set list was blazing: Bo Diddley's Who Do You Love, Travelin' Man, Beautiful Loser, Kathmandu, Ramblin' Gamblin' Man, and Led Zeppelin's Whole Lotta Love, among others. For fans who heard the broadcast or were in the room, it was unforgettable. One attendee recalled it as the best concert I've ever attended and one of the great memorable nights of my life, adding it was the first time they'd heard Kathmandu, a song from the Live Bullet album that was then making Seger a national star. The WXRT broadcast was later bootlegged under the incorrect title Live in Montreal 1978, before getting a proper CD release as Radio Chicago 1976, a time capsule of one of rock's great live performers at the exact moment he was crossing over from cult hero to mainstream icon. Rush, November 7, 1974. Rush's appearance at Beginnings in November of 1974, just 2 months after the club opened, represents one of the venue's earliest notable bookings. The Canadian power trio of Geddy Lee, Alex Lifeson, and Neil Peart, who had joined the band just months earlier in July of 1974, were touring behind their debut album and were still years away from the progressive rock epics that would define them. Rush appeared as the opening act that night for Irish blues rock guitarist Rory Gallagher, who returned to Beginnings multiple times and became a fan favorite. The Scorpions. August 1979. The German hard rock band Scorpions played Beginnings on August 7th and August 9th in 1979 during their Love Drive tour, their breakout American run. The shows were simulcast live on The Loop at 97.9 FM, and the Scorps Love Drive lineup featured both Rudolf Schenker and, briefly, his brother Michael Schenker, making these Beginnings shows a rare chance to catch both Schenker brothers on the same stage in a club setting. The Ramones, June 1977 and beyond. The Ramones connection to Beginnings spans multiple visits. June 21st, 1977 was Jam Productions' first ever show, with the band making it one of the earliest times the godfathers of punk rock appeared in the Chicago area. They returned on October 15th, 1979 during the Road to Ruin tour, and again on May 16th, 1980. Def Leppard, July 1980. British rockers Def Leppard played at Beginnings on July 17th, 1980 as part of their On Through the Night tour, notable as being the band's first ever headline concert in the United States. By the late 1970s, Beginnings had become one of the few suburban venues in the Chicago area willing to book punk, new wave, and ska acts, genres that most suburban club owners considered box office poison. The B-52s played on October 7th, 1979, touring behind their quirky, groundbreaking debut album and its surprise hit Rock Lobster. Devo appeared on November 1st, 1978, bringing their mechanical art rock weirdness and Energy Dome red hats to a venue decorated like a Chicago streetscape. XTC played multiple nights in early February 1980. Iggy Pop brought his nightclubbing tour through on October 3rd, 1980. Lena Lovitch, Skafish, The Specials, 999, and Dave Bromberg all graced the stage in the club's later days. The inclusion of Chicago punk pioneer Skafish in that list is significant. Jim Skafish and his band had been regulars at Beginnings since February 1976 when, as Skafish himself later recounted, his newly formed punk band first stepped on stage when we crashed an audition night at Club Beginnings. In a city where punk was still deeply underground, Beginnings gave Skafish a recurring platform that few other venues would have offered. Other notable acts that crossed the Beginning stage at various points include Pat Benatar, Joe Jackson, The Cars, The Knack, Ultravox, The Boomtown Rats, Tower of Power, Judas Priest, Santana, Johnny Winter, Iron Butterfly, Van Morrison, who, according to concert history databases and tour logs, list his Beginnings show date as October 17th, 1979, slotted between SIU Arena in Carbondale and the Hollywood Palladium. Who else? Lou Reed in May of 1978, Steppenwolf, Angel, The Runaways, Dave Mason, John Mellencamp when he was still billed as John Cougar, Rick Derringer, The Motels, and Rick Nelson. The full list of artists who performed at Beginnings, from national headliners to Monday night Battle of the Bands hopefuls, would run to hundreds of names. One thing I noticed while researching this episode was the number of performers who would play one night at Beginnings in Schaumburg and then play the next night in Chicago, most often at Park West. Different times, to be sure. While the headliners grabbed the historical attention, much of Beginnings' nightly identity was built by the local and regional bands that filled the calendar between the national acts. Pentwater, a progressive rock band, played roughly 10 gigs or more. Their bassist Ron Lasar remembered, "Great memories and always a good crowd, even though our prog rock wasn't exactly danceable. Dino and the gang were very supportive, and it was great to have pro sound and lighting compared to some other places." Pez Band, the power pop group that critics adored but the public largely ignored, was a regular. The Boys, The Hounds, Off-Broadway, The Shoes from Zion, Illinois, Kane, and The Names all logged multiple appearances. Monday night's Battle of the Bands gave unknown local groups their first taste of a professional stage. A member of a Southside black rock band later recalled that Dino, the club's manager, gave us a night to play there. He also stated he was very impressed with us. Dino gave a lot of unknown local bands an opportunity to play in a professional atmosphere. Beginnings wasn't only a concert venue. In the summer of 1975, during the endless summer tour that paired the Beach Boys and Chicago for 3 nights at the Chicago Stadium, the club was shut down for an entire weekend for a private event, the wedding and reception of Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson. Former employees recalled meeting members of both bands during the closure, an intersection of 1970s rock royalty, in a Schaumburg strip mall that seems almost too surreal to imagine. Danny Seraphine also used the club to develop his own side projects, a house band called Street Player, named after a Chicago song that Seraphine co-wrote, rehearsed and performed at Beginnings. The sound engineer who worked with the group recounted meeting Chicago members in December of 1976 when the band flew in from a show in southern Illinois specifically for a Street Player event. The crew that kept Beginnings running formed a tight-knit family whose members would still be searching for each other on social media decades later. Dino Colettis, who had grown up with Seraphine on the Northwest Side and managed the club through much of its run, was universally remembered with affection by former employees and regulars alike. Mike Fatone served as stage manager and sound engineer during the early years before illness forced him to step back. Keith Nelms, a jack-of-all-trades who worked as stage manager, sound engineer, lighting tech, DJ, announcer, was also right in the middle of much of the fun. The bartenders, the doormen, the waitresses, the coat check girls, they all became part of the Beginnings legend. Decades later, social media groups dedicated to the club would fill with questions like, does anybody remember Dino? And whatever happened to so-and-so? The digital equivalent of a high school reunion for a place that felt like family, even if the fire marshal thought it was dangerously overcrowded. So, what happened to Beginnings? There were a few factors, most of which developed in 1980. During the first 6 months of 1980, the U.S. economy entered the most significant recession since the Great Depression. This was right on the heels of the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which sparked a second round of oil price increases, echoing back to the 1973-1974 gas shortages and skyrocketing fuel prices. While the economy here in the States experienced a modest recovery beginning by the summer of 1980, there were concerns by promoters that audiences would not be willing to spend the money on tickets or want to use the gas to get there. The drive from the city to the suburbs had become even less appealing. On January 1st, 1980, Illinois raised the drinking age back to 21, 4 years before the federal government required it. The change was driven by rising concerns over drunk driving fatalities among young people. I remember my friend Callie telling me about driving from McHenry over the Wisconsin border, where she and friends were old enough to drink, and then driving back to Illinois. I mean, who could have foreseen issues with this? Studies later confirmed an 8.8% reduction in single-vehicle nighttime crashes among the affected age groups after the minimum drinking age was increased. Of course, this cut into Beginnings' core young audience. Also damaging to Beginnings was the opening of two competing music venues in the area. The Rosemont Horizon, with a capacity of more than 18,000, opened on May 15th, 1980. A few weeks after that, Poplar Creek, just a few miles from Beginnings, had its gala opening weekend on June 6th, 1980. Poplar Creek, the 20,000 capacity outdoor amphitheater, was a quantum leap in scale. Bands that had been playing at Beginnings for a few hundred fans were suddenly headlining, or at least opening, at Poplar Creek for thousands. The intimate club scene that Beginnings had nurtured was being rendered obsolete by the very success of the acts it helped launch. While the club had been admirably willing to book punk, new wave, and ska acts, the suburban audience in Schaumburg largely wasn't buying what the Ramones, XTC, and Iggy Pop were selling. The fans who wanted to see those artists lived primarily in the city, and Beginnings was, as even Seraphine admitted, impossible to reach by public transportation. Quote, "That was the one thing working against the club," he later acknowledged. In desperation, Beginnings dropped its rock identity and tried to reinvent itself as an adult-oriented concert-style facility, rebranding as New Beginnings and booking more mainstream acts like Robert Palmer in September of 1980 and Eddie Money. Billboard magazine even covered the pivot in its September 27, 1980 issue. the club underwent a total remodel and attempted to incorporate video technology. The final months were a procession of increasingly desperate bookings. Ian Gillan's post-Deep Purple band played on November 21st, 1980, one of the last documented major concerts at the venue. An ad for beginnings in late November 1980 stated, "Starting Monday, December 1st, Chicago's best female mud wrestling team, the Atomic Bombshells, live following Monday Night Football." I mean, I don't want to yuck anyone's yum, but mud wrestling shows seem like a grim marker of decline for a venue where Billy Joel and Van Morrison had performed. To be fair, I read an article that claimed about a dozen venues in Chicago hosted mud wrestling once or twice a week around that time, but still. Its run coming to a close, the club was sold in early 1981 and renamed Jay Lennon's, a tribute to John Lennon, who had been murdered just weeks earlier in December of 1980. But the new incarnation was short-lived. Jay Lennon's closed soon after, and the space was eventually converted into the Secretary of State's driver's license facility that occupies it to this day. There is something uniquely poignant about Beginnings' afterlife as a DMV. Anyone who's waited in line at the Illinois Secretary of State facility at 1227 East Gulf Road has stood in the same space where AC/DC's Angus Young ran across the bar top while Bon Scott roared, where Sting and the Police played for 7 shivering souls on a frigid winter night, where Elvis Costello debuted his angry brilliance for Chicago audiences, where David Byrne twitched and jerked through Psycho Killer. The stainless steel dance floor is gone. The black velvet curtains, gone. The Chicago Theater marquee replica that glowed above the bar, also gone. In their place, plastic chairs, numbered tickets, and the soul-crushing bureaucratic hum of license renewals. Beginnings lasted barely 7 years, from September 1974 to early 1981. In that brief window, it hosted performances by artists who would go on to sell hundreds of millions of records combined. It was the first Chicago stage for acts that would define multiple genres. It was where Danny Seraphine's dream of building the gold standard of rock clubs collided with the realities of suburban geography, changing demographics, a raised drinking age, organized crime whispers, bouncer controversy, and the relentless upward march of the artists it helped create, artists who inevitably outgrew a strip mall on Gulf Road. If you drive past the Secretary of State facility today, you'll see nothing that suggests what once was. There's no plaque, there's no historical marker, no faded mural, just a government office in a shopping center. If you do find yourself driving past the Woodfield Commons on Gulf Road, turn to your partner, friends, kids, whoever is in the car, point and let them know that back in the day, that's where Schaumburg rocked the suburbs. Thanks for listening to today's episode about Beginnings, where Schaumburg rocked the suburbs. This episode was written, recorded, and edited by me, Tommy Henry. As always, if you have questions about anything covered today, anything to add, or have an idea for a future episode, I'd love to hear about it. Not really. Send me an email at chicagohistorypod@gmail.com. I have links to items related to Chicago's amazing history in the show's notes if you or someone you know is a history nerd like me who would like to learn more. Anything ordered through those links, not just the items listed, may earn a small commission for the podcast and help offset production costs at no additional cost to you. Check out the Chicago History Podcast social media pages for articles and pictures related to this episode and past episodes posted throughout the week. Much of the original art for the Chicago History Podcast used on the social media pages was created by John K. Schneider. A sincere thanks, Johnny. If you need creative work done, you'll find no one better. Send him an email at angeleyesartjks@gmail.com. I will be back soon with more stories from Chicago's history. Until then, get out and explore when possible. Learn more about whatever city you live in, and stay safe.